Everyone, and very warm welcome to all our guests this morning. Great to have you online and joining us from across the globe. I'm Georgina Smith and I'm the Head of Distribution and Client Services at INN8. And this morning I'll be exploring with David Pullen from the Story Spotters how to use stories to help land your key messages. Before I introduce David, I'd like to just highlight a little bit of housekeeping. We have applied for CPD points for today's webinar. And as soon as we're able to distribute them, we will send them out via email. But to be eligible, you will need to be with us for the entire webinar. And unfortunately, CPD points are not available for those who are watching the recording today. As always, we love questions from our audience. Please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to answer them. Now, I'm delighted to welcome my good friend and guest today, David Pullen from the Story Spotters, a UK-based communication consultancy. He and his partner, Sarah Jane, have the sole aim of helping their clients to build deeply trusted connections through the power of story. And David's particular specialism is in financial services and helping people in our industry save their messages from dying on the rocks of complexity, boredom, and indifference. No mean feat, David, I think. His client list is spread throughout the globe and includes FTSE 100 CEOs, big advisory firms, tech startups, and even the US Navy SEALs. But recently he's been working in South Africa, helping advisory firms spot, shape, and share the stories that will stand out from the crowd. But before Story Spotters, David spent 20 years as a professional actor, and it's lovely to see 12th Night on the shelf behind you there, David. And he was with the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Royal National Theatre, the BBC, and Paramount Pictures. Welcome to INN8, David. So great to have you today.
It's brilliant to be here, and at least you guys are sunnier today. You're going into winter. I'm in the UK, and it's still warmer where you are. It's really lovely to be with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm down in Cape Town, and I don't mind telling you, I literally just took my jersey off before coming online today. It is pretty chilly over here.
Look at this. There's one day in August when I take this off.
Oh dear, absolutely. Typical British people talking about the weather.
Exactly.
But perhaps we could understand a little bit about how you got into storytelling. I mean, obviously coming from an acting background, it was probably quite a natural thing to move into. But let's understand, the importance of storytelling and how you actually morphed your way into really adding value into the world of professionalism, really.
Well, I mean, like you say, George, I mean, story wasn't new to me because I'd spent my whole life doing it as an actor. But the difference between that when you're performing and when you're entertaining people, as opposed to connecting and saving messages from horrible deaths, as you say, through in business, that was a totally other thing. And the way it happened, it was sort of towards the end of my acting career about 20 years ago. I was asked to develop a business course at a college in London, and it was called Your Voice is the Business. And it was for business people, and it was about how they actually showed up in the room and used their voice. And it was okay as a course, but the thing that everyone really remembered was an exercise that I'd do on the second half of the second day. And I'd get them to tell a story to each other about, something that they'd have to overcome and what the challenges were. It was something personal in their lives, and they got to tell the story to the whole group. And a coach friend of mine who came to me afterwards, who came in the course and said, David, I really like that course you do, but you could drop all of it and just do the storytelling course. And so that started me thinking. And then cut to about 2 or 3 years later, my wife, Sarah Jane, was already doing this business. And she got quite ill, actually. She got sort of chronic fatigue syndrome. And she had a client in Switzerland. It was just at the time of Sarbanes-Oxley coming in and everything, the Enron crash. And she was helping a client. It was KPMG, actually. And she was helping them pitch for a bunch of Sarbanes-Oxley work with Swiss Re, I think it was. And she basically woke up one morning and she couldn't get out of bed. And she said, David, you're going to have to take over. This is it. So my learning curve was like that. And I went off to, and my acting, the best acting I ever did in my life. So I flew to Zurich and I was with these guys who were basically talking stuff I had no idea what they were on about. And I remember on the first morning we were sitting around and they were talking through the presentation. And I just said, guys, listen to some really interesting energy here, some interesting things going on. Let's take a break and then we'll come back and see how all this fits together. And I ran to the loo and I got my phone out and said, Sarah Jane, I literally have no idea what they're talking about. And she said, you can probably be pretty sure they don't either. So get them to tell you a story that makes it make sense, which I did. They then ended up using those stories in the final presentation and winning it. And so I thought, oh, okay. So what I've been doing anyway was what was needed. So that was the start of a very long journey, which has involved hypnotherapy and studying psychology and all sorts of stuff since then to bring story to business.
And today, David, we'll be exploring, why it's so important, and that actually there is quite a lot of science behind storytelling. But let's touch on and actually, of course, where people go wrong. I mean, I think we've all been in those deadly storytelling experiences. David, before we get going onto any of that, let's understand why it's so important. Why is storytelling so important and relevant for for the business world?
Well, George, I think there are two things here. I mean, there are two ways, especially when we're coming to a new client, there are two ways that we can experience what it's like working with us. Say, if I was to say, come and work with me, I'll help you out. The two ways you can experience it are either you coming and working with me and getting the experience of that, or me telling you the story of what other people have experienced. And that's, our brain doesn't know the difference. And if you tell that story well enough, and especially in the business that everyone watching today is in, what does it look and feel like? What's beyond the facts? And I think beyond the facts is an interesting thing to say, because what I'm not saying here is that the facts aren't important, because the facts, the data, everything that you guys deal with day to day is incredibly important, but it isn't what's going to win the day for you. A good story is facts put in context and told with feeling. That's what a story is. And the other thing is, if we think in terms of influence, what we're basically every day we're trying to influence people. We're trying to influence, persuade them to come and work with us. There are two forms of influence. There's what I would call push influence, which is where you just push the facts at people. And you know well enough, George, you used to be rugby referee. I mean, there are two forms. In rugby, if you know what happens if somebody pushes against you, you push back. And it's, they question you a lot. But story does what I would call pull influence. It weaves people in, it gets people feeling connected to you, and then you start giving them the information. So story is a softer and a more gentle, but it's a bit like Aikido. It's using somebody else's power against themselves in order to weave them in.
You touched on, I think, one of the key relevancies, I think, of storytelling. And I, as you know, I'm incredibly passionate about storytelling. You and I met actually on a course about storytelling some years ago. And actually, one of the first places you can use storytelling is in that connection. Can I connect with you? And there's a whole load of science, of course, as to why connection is so important. And we can delve into that a little bit more. And a lot of it is around trust, but a lot of it is also about, I hear you. I want to hear your stories. Let me tell you my story, and I want to hear your stories. But is that really the way in through connection, or are there other ways in which we should be thinking about stories?
I think there are, but it absolutely starts with connection. I fundamentally believe it does start with connection. There's a couple of things in there, actually. There's a book I read probably a couple of years ago called Face to Face by a guy called Brian Grazer, who's actually the director, Ron Howard, who, you'll have seen, he was in Happy Days originally, but you'll have seen Captain Phillips and all sorts of movies. Brian Grazer is his producer, and he, the book came about Face to Face because Ron Howard said to him one day, he said, Brian, you know what would be really interesting when we're going in for our meetings with investors, if you actually took your head away from your phone and actually looked at people occasionally. So Brian did this self-experiment where he sort of said, I'm just going to really connect with people and just actually sort of try and understand them. And he did that himself for a year. And then he interviewed a lot of people as well. One of the people he interviewed was Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah Winfrey said that the one question she always gets asked at the end of every interview, and it doesn't matter whether it's with Prince Harry or a miner from Kentucky, she says she always gets asked the question, was that okay? And I think that that's what that plays to is a fundamental human need to feel that we've been listened to, that we've been understood. And too often what we do, whether we're telling stories or not, we go into solution mode. We go into, here's the problem, here's the solution, take it or leave it. It's that push thing again. Whereas if you play back to people, I get you, I understand where you're coming from, I understand what heaven looks like to you, what good looks like to you, then you can start introducing some of the other things. I know later we'll talk about a little model that works with that, but there's a thing which I love called the relationship triangle, which was developed by a guy called John Timperley, who was a marketing guy at PwC in the UK. I think he's at least retired now, if not more than that. But he's he does the relationship triangle. Basically starts at the level of what he calls acknowledgement. You all today knew you were about to show up and meet somebody called David Pullen. Then the next level is understanding. You have to understand what David Pullen's about. And ideally, if we were in the room, more importantly, I have to understand what you're about. Then you would accept it, hopefully, if it makes sense to you. And then there's the respect and the trust and the bond. I think in business, we rush too fast to trying to get to the respect and the trust and the bond, which hardly ever happens, just because that's where the money's made. And we need to spend more time on the understanding level, which, as I say, is pretty low down, but it's the rich soil where the relationship is really made. And that's with the stories. It's telling your stories and understanding the stories of others.
How do you do that? How do you, I've got a plethora of stories I could tell. I'm not sure I would want to tell all of them. Some of them wouldn't be appropriate to tell. But how do you know the right story to tell at the right moment to connect and get that bottom level you're talking about in that relationship triangle? How do you know that it's the right time to do that?
A little bit of research goes a very long way. An index finger in Google goes quite a long way just to actually do that. I mean, I can tell you a couple of stories about that. I mean, the number of times that I've been into offices in London and, not having met the person before, but seeing sort of like I remember there was an Aussie rules football on a guy's, and I'm originally from Australia, and there was a St Kilda football on his desk, and I said, oh God, I'm from Adelaide, and that's so you've got a St Kilda, and we were away. I mean, we barely spoke about business from that point on. There was another guy I remember years and years ago, and it was for a pitch for one of the really big building societies in the UK. And the guy had to go and meet the chief exec, and he said to me, David, I literally have no idea how to start this meeting. What am I going to do? And I said, what do you know about him? And he said, well, he's been in the city for this long. I just went on my phone, Googled it, and it turned out they'd been at the same college at Cambridge. And so, that is an absolutely open goal. So it was like, you don't tell your story. You just say, I noticed this about you. I mean, I was there as well. Tell me, and did you know such and such? And then suddenly you're into story. I mean, that is the connection as much as anything. In fact, you and I connected over cats. I remember that. That was in the heady days of Zoom when cats were walking in front of screens the whole time. Your cat was having a very nice time. I think we connected over cats before.
We did connect over cats. I seem to remember you got a very graphic view of my cat. But anyway, and it's actually really interesting you say that, because I'm thinking about some of the, I run a sales team, and I've recruited over the years many people. And some of the best interviews I can remember, and I know this sounds like noddy, and it sounds like, of course you research the person who's going to interview you.
Yeah. But
yes, you might research them, but do you think about the story you're going to tell, as a result of what they've done? And I since I've been in South Africa, I do a lot of mountain biking, and I can remember one of the interviews I have with one of my sales team who is brilliant and with us now in Cape Town. And he spent a long time telling me about a mountain bike, a race that he'd set up, and he was raising money for Save the Rhinos. And in fact, we didn't even do anything that we were supposed, or HR wanted us to do, in terms of the technical questions that you're supposed to ask to make sure that they can do the job. We talked about mountain biking for an hour, and he's been with us for three years or so, and a brilliant sales guy. They're the best kind of interviews, and all he did there was connect with me. All he did was that bottom layer.
Connected with you, and also was willing to be. I mean, there's a lot talked about vulnerability and authenticity, and that certainly isn't, when I talk about vulnerability or anyone, they shouldn't be talking about sort of bearing your soul and saying, oh, I had a terrible childhood, but actually it's about dealing with stuff it's about being able to reveal stuff that you've dealt with, that you're happy to talk about. And I mean, I remember a good example of that. I work with a lot of people at PwC who are going for partnership, and they always get that first question. So tell me a bit about yourself. And the last thing people want is the CV, but it's probably the first thing that people do. And I remember there was it was a woman actually in Ireland, and she said, well, I don't tell people this, but I completely built my house or renovated my house from the ground up, everything, wiring, plastering, the works, via YouTube videos. And they went, what? And the whole thing she'd done herself, she's not an inch that I don't know, because I've done everything in there and I just looked it up on YouTube. And there was so much you could infer about her from that. They didn't talk about her business case at all. And she's now been a partner for 3 years. So, I mean, it's,
Really?
yeah, it's just about sort of like showing a bit of, we're human beings in the end, and human beings, we're wired for story. We're wired for it. Our lives are about making sense through story.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. And some of the most productive conversations I've had have been with brilliant storytellers. Either, me drawing a story out, or someone else in the room telling a story that then gets another story going. And a wonderful phrase is, that's enough about me. What about you? Drawing that story out. I think we can thank Mike Adams for that one.
We can indeed. Yeah.
Another brilliant storyteller. So David, let's understand, perhaps a little bit more of the framework someone might use to explore a story in a more business context. What would that look like? And how can you use that story to connect with the person that you're talking to, whilst understanding their problem and hopefully, getting to that solution mode, assuming you've done that soil level groundwork of that relationship triangle that you're talking about?
Well, when I talk about story, and I sort of go a bit off rail with some storytelling people on this, I think that there are stories. There are beginning, middle, and end stories which last a couple of minutes. But the reality is, how often in life do you get the opportunity to say those to people, unless somebody has asked you for the story, or indeed if you're doing a presentation whereby they actually, the floor is yours. So I'm going to talk about three things here, George. There's one thing called the ABT framework, which we should start with, which stands for and, but, therefore. And I'm going to call that's almost like the Christmas tree. That's the structure. That's the narrative, if you like. Then there are the stories which we think of as stories, beginning, middle, and end. They're like the decorations that go onto this framework, onto this narrative, onto this Christmas tree, that bring it to life. But there's another thing that I'm really interested in as well, which some people call micro stories, which are almost like little sentences which trigger stories in other people. And if you get those right, those are incredibly powerful, because you can get, and I think we'll talk about all three of those as the session goes on. But the first one, the ABT, should we start there?
Yeah, let's start there. I think the ABT is a really useful model, and it's a practical tool that people can take away from this webinar today and try. And I challenge people listening, give it a go in the next couple of days. Let us know how you got on, because it's such a simple framework that you can use to actually connect with people and understand their problems. Well,
I mean, I've been doing this for a number of years, as you can see by my hair, but I mean, I'd go as far as to say that this, the ABT, which was taught to me by a man called Professor Randy Olson, who's he was a environmental biologist. No, he wasn't. He was an evolutionary biologist at Harvard, and then he became a filmmaker. He was the person that sort of came up with the ABT, but he didn't really come up with it, because when you think about it, it goes back to as far as Aristotle, and thinking about sort of what are great stories made of. And it's a 3-act structure, which is and, but, and therefore. The and bit, the first bit, is the bit where, like we were saying before, where you absolutely connect with the other person. You go, I see what it is you're trying to achieve here, and I know why you're trying to achieve it. If you get this, then this, and then this, and this will happen. And then, so they're nodding. There's no controversy at all. So I understand what you're trying to do with your funds. And if you do that with your funds, then you'll be able to do this. Then you change the tone with a but. And the but is like when the shark appears in Jaws. It's like, but there's a problem. because you know whatever the problem could be in your world. And then of course what that does to the brain, it arouses the brain because there's a problem that needs solving. And then the therefore is where you settle the brain back down. So the ABT very cleverly does three things which every listener needs. It makes them feel connected to. It surprises them with the and, the and is the bit where you feel connected and they're nodding away going, you understand me, you get me, thank you. Then the but surprises them and makes them go, oh, I didn't see that bit. And then it calms them back down with the therefore. So one that I mean, if I could say that one that I could do would be sort of from my business, I could say something like, every time a proposal comes across your doorstep, your teams spend a huge amount of time and money trying to get those key messages right. And if they get those messages right, then that can be the start of a really long and lucrative career. And if those messages land. But too often those messages crash and burn because people are starting to prepare from what they want to say rather than what people need to hear. So therefore, what I do is I make sure that those messages land safely and stand out from the crowd using the art and science of story. And I bet every one of your people listening today, in terms of your business, what makes you stand out from the crowd in your business, could think, this is what the client needs, this is what they're trying to achieve, but I can tell them a problem they're about to have, therefore this is how I overcome it. So you need to do a little bit of research in terms of understanding specifically, because stories love specifics. Who does that person sitting in front of you right now, what do they need? What does good look like to them? And indeed, what are the problems that are really going to stand out for them? The ABT is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I love this simplicity of it, and I love the fact you haven't effectively told a third party sales story, which is I'm amazing and I did this and and I also haven't given you my CV. Here I am. Let me tell you about myself. You've actually got to grips under the skin of understanding the person you're talking to. You've done what I'm always telling my team to do, is scratch the scab. Understand.
Yes, that's great. I love that. Yeah.
Understand the problem. Let's really get to the bottom of the problem, scratch the scab, and then present the solution to the person in front of you.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really effective way of putting that all together. Have you got any instances where perhaps this has worked really well?
Oh, pretty much every single day of my working life. I mean, like I say, I was introduced to this about 2.5 years ago by Randy Olson. And it was one of those things that when Sarah Jane and I got it, we thought that's like the missing link. This is the DNA. This is the DNA of story. Because like I say, the other stories come on the back of it. I work a lot with proposals. I work a lot with teams who are doing some pretty big proposals globally. And I always am looking for the ABT that starts. I can't think of a single one in the last 2 years, and I'm talking about some very big ones in South Africa and right around the world, where the ABT is almost like the first thing you say after thanks for having us here today. We know that you're trying to achieve this and this and this and this, and if you do it, then such and such will happen. But you're going to be aware that this is out there. This is the shock that's going to get you at some point. Therefore, what we want to talk to you about today is how we're going to, and I'm not going to go into specifics because that would be sort of client confidentiality. But George, the great thing about it is it gets people leaning in. And the danger with story in business is you've got to earn the right to tell the story. If there's not a relevance and there's not a context, then it's almost the exact opposite if you were telling a story to your kids. You've got to actually sort of get right in there and make people go, so tell me how you do that then. That's what I love about the ABT. So I can't think of a single day when I don't use it.
I also love it. And why I also love it is the simplicity of it. And the simplicity, particularly in this industry, you see a hell of a lot of complexity. Sometimes I think complexity is there just to justify the being of certain entities or people or whatever. But there are some instances where it is incredibly complex and you need to bring it down to a very simple level. And I think this does it very, very well.
I think that's an interesting point you do there, is that, one of the challenges that people say is, but it's not that simple. Introducing something is you've got to open people's minds up at the beginning so that they're willing to listen. I mean, we know that there is so much information coming at us left, right, and center every moment of every day. And essentially what you have to realize is that everyone is looking for a really good reason not to listen to you. They don't want to spend the brain glucose. I mean, there's other things we've got to do. So the great thing about the great thing about the ABT, and we will listen to the stuff that A, seems simple, B, surprises us or seems different, and is relevant to us as well. So the ABT does all of those things, which is a great thing, and it earns you the right to get more complex if it's appropriate.
And it also, I mean, one of the questions that I think I would have is, gosh, it feels like it could take quite a long time. Yeah. But actually it doesn't. It gets you to it's very quick, isn't it?
It should be a good ABT. You should be able to get out 30 seconds to 45 seconds. You said before it's very simple. That's where the complexity of the ABT comes in, is actually honing it down to that, so that you get that really, really short. It's like an elevator pitch, really. See it as like a structure for an elevator pitch, but don't overcomplicate it, because you don't want people shutting off then. It's the wedge into the door. You don't need them closing off too early.
No, absolutely. So David, we've spoken there about the ABT model. I think it's a very useful model. But therefore, and I understand you, but I'm scratching the scab.
Smack.
Therefore, there's a shark coming, and therefore here's the solution.
Exactly.
And I think that "and" bit is where you get that that bottom level of the relationship triangle going. It's a very nice model to do that. You mentioned two other types of stories earlier on, David. Shall we explore those?
Before, can I just say the "but" thing is really interesting, and actually that's where I would encourage everyone to really think about the problem that's facing them. Really think about how you structure and phrase the problem, because there's a strange psychological truth, and I have no idea how psychologists measure this, but there is a psychological fact that the person who describes the problem best is deemed to have the solution. So that more that you can talk about what the problem is that your client might have in terms of investing their money, their brain is going, oh, they understand that so well, they must have the answer to this. So I think the "and" and the "but" are really good. The "therefore" should be almost like the teaser to, so let me get into telling you how I can do that. And that's where we get into these other stories, as you're saying, which are, there's the full-blown story, which if you get a good ABT in place, people go, so tell me how you do that then. And then there are the micro stories, which, I mean, I could give you an example of both of those if you want. I mean,
I'd love to hear those examples. I think, from a storyteller like you, I think it's, they're really interesting examples, I think. So yes, please. Yes, I'd love to hear them.
So so say I've done that ABT, which I did right at the beginning, and I ended up with saying, but the problem is a lot of those messages crash and burn because people are preparing from what they want to say rather than what people want to hear. So therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you really stand out from the crowd through the power of story. And it's interesting, just back at the end of 2019, I was introduced to a guy who's become a good friend now. He's an architect called Jeff, and he's an Australian. He lives in the UK. And Jeff basically makes huge universities around the world, and he's very, very successful. And he was in this competition in the Middle East, in Bahrain, that he was desperate to win because it was very prestigious. But he knew that the competition was huge. It was, there was nothing that he thought was going to make him stand out. So I was introduced to him, and I had an initial chat with Jeff, and he told me what his worries were about it. And I said, Jeff, what do you actually do in that? I mean, it's your business. I mean, I'm presuming you aren't drawing the designs anymore. And he said, no, not really. I don't. I mean, I said, so what do you do? And he thought for a minute, and he said, do you know, essentially, David, I mean, there's a truth in architecture projects, is that at some point, the client is going to absolutely hate the architect. And my job is to make sure that isn't at the end of the project. And there was silence in the room. I said, Jeff, have you ever used that line? He went, no, I can't use that line. There's no way. I mean, it presupposes there's a problem. I said, you not only should, but you have to use that line. So he prepared his presentation. his partners gave him so much pushback and said, you can't say it. And he said, listen, David says I should use it. Anyway, he went off to Bahrain, he pitched for this thing. And I got a phone call a couple of days later. He said, David, can I tell you what happened? I went, yeah, sure, absolutely. He said, so that it went very well. Walked them through the models about everything. They loved it. They thought it was wonderful. And at the end of it, they said, is there anything you want to say before we wrap up today? He said, yes, I do. Can I just say to you that it's been great meeting you? And whoever you choose for this project, I can guarantee you one thing. There is going to be a moment when you hate the architect. And my job is to make sure that isn't at the end. Thank you very much. And off he walked. And apparently, about 2 days later, he got a phone call from the client saying, it's yours. And it was this sort of drop, I'm not saying that that's the sole reason was that line, but it did do a couple of things. We can tear that story apart there about what was happening in that story, but there's also something in that last line, which is the micro story that we can come to as well.
Absolutely. It's a fabulous story. And, and it's told so brilliantly. And we've spoken a bit as well. And having done this stuff between us quite a lot, you can see lots of elements of what are important in stories there, can't you? In fact, David, it reminds me of a story that I told you.
Oh, yes. We talked about this at the weekend and you came up with a brilliant, go on, I want this one. I love this story.
Mine goes back further. My story goes back further. And at the end, we can tear these stories apart as to why they work and why they don't work. But my story goes back a fair bit further. And many moons ago, my first foray into the world of work was in telesales. In fact, I joined a firm as something called the Girl Friday, which I'm pretty sure would be illegal now. But back in the mid-90s, that's what we were. We were Girl Fridays and we went into telesales. And I was selling what was data cabling. So you might not get it these days, but in those days, before the world of Bluetooth and wireless, we were selling data cabling, and it would go through various office blocks in false ceilings and false floors. And every so often we'd put trunking in, and trunking is a plastic sleeve that hides the cabling. I don't, probably younger listeners and viewers won't necessarily know what that is anymore, but anyway, it existed. And in the main, it was bright white. Anyway, we used to, as telesales people, we used to, as we were driving through the countryside, we would look for people who were building office blocks and or doing some sort of development. And then we'd phone the IT person and we'd say, hey, do you want some data cabling to fit out your office block? And sometimes we'd get lucky, sometimes we wouldn't. And I remember one weekend, I seem to remember it was around about 1998. And I went up to London with my friends and I went to the Natural History Museum. And those of you who've been to the Natural History Museum, it's the most beautiful building. It's a grade 2 listed building. It's enormous and it's full of dinosaurs. And I could see that they were doing some remodeling in the East Wing. And bearing in mind, up until this point in time, we've been selling data cabling to small to medium-sized businesses, anything like the Natural History Museum, nothing that sort of size. And I remember looking at it thinking, wow, what if we landed something like this? I wonder if they need some data cabling. So after a little bit of recceing around, I got hold of the head of IT and I explained what we did. And he said, well, it's interesting. You should call me now. Yeah, I'm actually interested. Yeah, please come up and see me. Now, my job was then to hand it on to the sales guy, who was a chap called Guy. And he pretty much went white when I told him that he was going to the Natural History Museum. It was way bigger than anything we'd done before. And he said, what am I going to say? How am I going to actually sell this? And I said, look, he's got a problem, and we understand the problem. But the problem he's going to have, Guy, is that it's a grade 2 listed building. He's going to need trunking. There's no false floors. There's no false ceilings. But the thing we've got is camouflage trunking. And just, you could even tie it into the dinosaurs. You're running cabling from T-Rex to Diplodocus. You could even tell a story around how dinosaurs used to camouflage themselves. So buoyed up, bushy-tailed, off he went up to London. And needless to say, that became our biggest job that we ever got for that company.
Wow.
It ran for years and years and years. We had engineers going up every night, working through the night, think night at the museum. That's pretty much what it was. It became an enormous contract for us. And all because, we went through that but therefore,
exactly.
even though I did it subconsciously.
Do you know what, George? That's great. And if we think about, I can imagine that being a great story to tell to a sales team about, what I infer there is never say never. And, that's a great thing about stories. You don't always need to tell people the point, but often we'll come to that in a second. But it's there's a lot you can infer from a story, and there's a lot of sort of like thinking, just because something seems like too big an opportunity, don't say no to it immediately. That could be a great message in there for a sales team. And similarly with my story, there was a point there which was about you've got to, to win, you've got to find the moment that makes you stand out from the crowd. And for Jeff, it was that his final phrase there. As I listened to that, to you tell that story, well, I'm going to say one thing first before we get to the elements. And this is what people have to remember, is nobody is going to enjoy your story more than you enjoy telling it. So you better get a bit George on this and sort of, enjoy telling your stories, because, it's very infectious the way you tell it.
Oh, thanks, David. Look, you're absolutely right, but it doesn't, it is something you have to rehearse, isn't it? A story.
You do.
And you can't just rock up somewhere and think, I'm going to tell that story, and you've never actually told it before. I've told that story several times, and I know how it flows, and I know the bits and pieces, just as you've told Jeff's story several times. And I'm going to come back to, common pitfalls that people fall into when telling stories later on. But let's understand the elements of the story. I would love to pick those stories apart, perhaps improve them. If you think there's anything in there we can improve in there, but let's pick them apart, because there's the science behind storytelling, isn't there?
There is.
Which you need to understand to be able to land a story. And a lot of people do it subconsciously. They don't even know they're doing it. They don't even know why their story resonates so well. But actually, what we're about to unpick, David, is why they resonate so well.
Okay, absolutely. And the first thing you always have to remember, what everyone has to remember, is that in business, stories start with a very, very clear point. Now, your ABT could be your point at the beginning. In fact, it's a great way of opening up the point. But with George and me there, say we're in the middle of a conversation, George could have said, I think it's really important that sales teams never say no to big opportunities, because you never know what's going to happen to them. I remember back in 1990, and then you're off into it. So starting with your point is because it makes people think, okay, there's a relevance here. I can see why this is relevant to me. And it's the opposite, because what I always say is, if my son, who's now 28, but when he was a young kid, if I'd taken him to bed at night with a bedtime story and said, Charlie, I'm about to tell you a story about why you must never take apples from old ladies in the forest, because the apples are always poisoned and the old lady turns out to be a witch, he'd have gone, Dad, why are you bothering? It's sort of like, don't tell me the story, you've told me the end. In business, you sort of need to tell them the end first. You need to say, this is why you're about to hear this. And then there are some elements which really make our brains, without going into the science of it, our brains go, I'm about to learn something here. And that's time and place. So we knew it was the Natural History Museum. You knew it was 1990 something. You knew it was 2019 and at my friend Jeff's architect's office. Time and place always is a good place to start. Character. Who are we following through this story? And interestingly, I think we were following you in your story. It was about George sort of, as a good salesperson, realizing that, no opportunity is too big. In my story, and I think this is what I'd like you guys to take away from this today, I wasn't the hero of my story. The hero was Jeff. Jeff is the one who turned up with an issue, with a problem, with a competition he wanted to win. I was like Obi-Wan Kenobi to his Luke Skywalker. I was the mentor who helped him overcome that problem that he had to solve. And that's one thing that I think we always have to remember in business telling, in business stories, especially in advisory work or things where there is a relationship. People aren't really interested in your story. What they're interested in is how you make their story better.
Yeah.
So everyone listening today will have stories about how they have made other people's lives and investments better. So use those. How have you mentored people into success? And then, of course, there are the series of events, and you wonderfully got lots of buts in there because, excuse me, a good story. We could tell a story. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, but it's a story. It's a series of events. It's just not a very good story, because a good story is about overcoming problems. And there were lots of them in yours. In mine, there was Jeff's doubt about whether it would work at all. His partners challenging him. Find the butts in your stories. I often say stories love big butts.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And then so what I've heard there is, and it's so important, you've got time, place, and both of us use time, place. Who are you following through the story? Who's the character? And if it's a third-party sales story, if you're trying to sell something, you need to be the coach, not the main character. Yeah. And then there needs to be a piece of adversity in the story that you've overcome.
Yeah.
Now, what makes it really listenable is the moments. Yeah, and perhaps you could understand and explain a little bit more about what a moment is and how you can even extract it into other stories.
It's an interesting one, that, isn't it, George? It is. What the moments are. I mean, I often say, I did a post about this on LinkedIn yesterday, and if anyone wants to follow me, I post about story all the time. But excuse me, I was just saying about how we don't remember whole plots of films. We remember the moment in, when Michael Corleone in The Godfather says, "I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse," or when who is it in Gone with the Wind says, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," or "We're going to need a bigger boat" in Jaws. I mean, we remember those moments, and to find the little bit that sticks out, that sticks in the room, that stays in the room. Do you remember when he told us that one about? Those are the moments. Those are the moments that you really want to try and find. And in my moment, I think, is Jeff's realization, or the moment of when he said, "My job is to make sure it's not right. It's not right at the end," and that sort of kept getting repeated. There's an interesting thing about memory as well that happens here. We remember high peak moments, and we remember what is repeated. We also remember the last thing that is said to us. So at the end of Jeff's story, that was sort of like the peak moment at the end. It was about sort of like he said that, dropped the mic, left. It's the last thing people hear. And also it's peak emotionally a moment as well. So finding those little moments, a good way of finding them actually is dialogue. So I was in there talking to the client, and if you can say, and he said to me, "Do you know what? I'm down to my last X amount of rand. If I don't actually sort of invest this well, then quite frankly, X will happen." I said, whatever it is, whatever the story, I'm making that up off the top of my head, but actually bits of dialogue are very good moments. Do you remember when they told us that story about the guy who was down to his last 10,000 rand, whatever it was?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, that tends to be how I get into moments in stories that I tell is you take people to the dialogue. If you're in sport, when you're telling the story of sport, whether it's a rugby match or whatever, you can talk about the scrum, the ruck that ensues, the play going down the back line, and you can say that it's moving from this player to this player to this player. Now I'm in that story, I'm living it, I can remember, and you're jogging my memory, and I can feel it. I mean, you can also talk about the weather and the needling rain and it getting under your skin. All of those kind of things bring it to life.
But I remember actually when you took, because I mean, I don't know how many people know you well on this call already, but you having met your husband when you were refereeing in rugby, I then said to you, "So what happened? Did you sort of like walk straight off the pitch and get engaged?" And you said, "No, it was at the end of the season. It was a dinner, and you walked down in your ball gown, and he was at the bar, and he recognized you as the person who'd sent him off, and he went, 'Well, this is awkward, isn't it?'" Or you said, but it was that little moment of dialogue of sort of see two people there. "Oh, you're the bugger who sent me off."
Yeah, that's right. I mean, for those of you that are listening that don't know, I'm not going to go into the story now. That's for another day and a few beers probably. But yes, I met my husband by sending him off, and I think 17 years later, we're still happily married. Happily most of the time, Still the cards come out at home every so often. But yes, you see, and again, quite a memorable story. Partly because it's unusual, but you're absolutely right. You go into the dialogue there, don't you?
Yeah.
what I want to talk about in the last little bit, David, if I may, is the do's and the don'ts of stories.
Absolutely.
And
One second, George. Can I? There was a third one. There was a micro story that I talked about as well.
Yes.
I just want to say that because, like I say, quite often you won't get an opportunity to tell long stories, and a micro story is a well-chosen sentence or something that is going to trigger thoughts in other people's heads. Basically stories exist all the time. You say something to somebody and they go, oh, what's that looking like to me? Within the Jeff story, that sentence, there is one moment where you're going to absolutely hate the architect. My job is to make sure that isn't at the end. That in itself is a micro story, because immediately that triggers in the brain of the person listening, oh, I wonder what could go wrong. How am I going to hate? What am I going to hate those other guys for? Well, I'm not going to hate him because he'll have been all over me right throughout the whole project. So just in that one sentence, you trigger a story through the micro story. Choose it well. You got to trigger the right story. So actually sort of, do you know what? I think a variation on that line probably serves pretty well for everyone on this call.
Yeah, because a micro story, you don't have to get into the whole, the whole journey of the story. You can literally just tell that little micro story, and you transport someone into a position of empathy. Actually, they understand where you are. I like that.
Yeah. So you're asking about the pitfalls?
Yeah, I'm conscious of time as well, and I think it's really important that we do explore where people often go wrong with storytelling. And what are the common pitfalls, David, around storytelling?
I think there are three biggies, and they probably revolve around not starting well, not ending well, and not getting the right detail in there or getting the wrong detail in there. So if I go into those one by one, the first thing about starting well, there's a friend of my wife's who was an Olympic rower. She won silver in Seoul, I think. And I remember her telling us that when she was double sculls, and she said, I remember her saying that when you're doing that rowing, and maybe people on here who've rowed said, when you're in a race, you know that in a few minutes' time, you're basically going to be blind with pain. You're going to be throwing up over the side of the boat, and your life is going to be pretty miserable. But you can't think about that. All you can think about is the first three strokes. Get the rhythm going, get the pace going, get the timing going, and then you're off. You're into it. And I think with storytelling, get your opening right. Think to yourself, what are the equivalent of your first three strokes? What are your first three lines that just get you off at the right tempo? And that might be around time, place, and the character, introducing them. Or it might be setting it up with a good ABT.
David, I've got to interrupt. What a lovely micro story you just told there with the rower. That's lovely.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. No, she's quite something, actually. I love that. The first three strokes. It's
very, very good.
So, and then the other thing is know where you're going to end as well. What is your point? What is the point you're driving to at the end? Get there and park the thing. I mean, I've listened to too many stories in my time, which are a bit like drunk driving, and people are like this going, well, I hope this gets home eventually. And it's like, because they have no idea where they're going to with it. So know your beginning and then know your end. And then you mentioned something, George, about the details that you can bring in. You could have talked about the driving rain and the smell of the bacon frying or whatever it is. I mean, what you've got to do is actually sort of pick your details very carefully, and they have to be material. They have to be relevant to the story. There's a writer, Anton Chekhov, to misquote him, sort of said something like, if you bring a gun on in Act 1, it better go bang in Act 3. So, I mean, if that gun's, so if you don't want to walk in and say, oh, I remember there was a gun sitting on the client's wall over there, and then just think, why did he tell me about the gun? Or why did he tell me about the driving rain if the rain wasn't important? If he didn't close the deal in that driving rain later on with the papers all, soaking wet. So choosing the wrong detail. Start well, first three strokes, know where you're going to park the thing, and only introduce detail if it's relevant, but do find that detail, because that becomes the moments.
Yeah, and that's when you dip in and you come straight back out again. You go through the story, down into the detail and back out again, and they'll remember that in the detail piece
Exactly
as well.
right. You can't spend too long down there, otherwise people are thinking, "Oh, come on, just get on with it. Get on."
Yeah.
With it. It's about the way you describe it there is perfect. It's about get us to that point, dive into the detail, come back out again, move us on.
Absolutely.
Like films do.
And tell me, I spoke about it earlier. Something that I believe hugely in is rehearsal and rehearsing the story. And I think back to my refereeing career. And you actually used to rehearse what you would say in certain situations. So you'd envisage a situation. It might be a red card offence. It might be a fight. It might be, just an offence at a ruck or a mall. And you'd actually practice what you say. And you certainly practice how you're going to get your cards out and what you're going to say when you get your cards out. Otherwise, you say things like, that was unacceptable.
How wonderful.
It becomes very uncontrolled. And
who's that great Welsh referee? Nigel
Owens.
Nigel Owens, I love him. Did you think he rehearses all that? I don't know if we've met each other. I'm the referee. Don't know if you've met each other, young man.
And the line out, when people throw the line out and he says things like, I'm straighter than that. So, no, of course he does. It's all rehearsed. He's a fantastic guy, fantastic referee.
So rehearsing, absolutely. And people go, the number of people say, I like to be off the cuff. I don't, when I was an actor, you would rehearse for anywhere between 4 and 8 weeks for a show. The reason you do that is not so that it goes right. You rehearse so that it can never go wrong. And that's why you need to rehearse your stories. And indeed, like you were saying, George, about when you're rehearsing what you're going to say at the ruck and everything, it's not. So in the heat of the moment, when you've got a million other things you're thinking about, because there's the pressure of the pitch or the pressure of the key conversation or the pressure of the networking event, if somebody woke you up in the middle of the night and said, tell me the story about, you could just do it. It's just off pat. So rehearse so that it will never go wrong, not so that it'll go right. You have to go beyond that. And that's really important.
And again, I'm sorry, I'm going back to rugby, but if you think about these days, the complexity that referees in rugby particularly have to deal with, and I'm thinking about going to the TMO particularly, it's very, very high pressure when they go to the TMA. Usually it's around the try line or it's around some sort of match changing decision. The way, and there are some people who are really good at doing it, and there's some people who've really fallen over. And I think back to the Lions, and I think back to Nick Berry and how he did it, and really threw the TMO under the bus because it wasn't rehearsed. And I think about Wayne Barnes, someone like Wayne Barnes. It is measured, controlled, rehearsed, and you just look at those communication styles and you look at the difference, and you can see how well rehearsed it is. And I encourage anyone that's thinking of exploring storytelling more, find a friend or your family, or stand in front of the mirror at home, practice your story, and practice when you would tell it. And that's the bit I want to talk about next, David, if I may. Sure. I think about, particularly in South Africa, I think we've got some terrific storytellers. I think about where I've experienced amazing storytellers, particularly in the battlefields in KZN, and you listen to these emotional stories about the Battle of Islandwana, and then followed by Rorke's Drift, and you'll see a whole group of people in tears listening to and being taken through the moments of the story, following the characters in the story, and seeing the time and the place of when the story takes place. And it's a very moving and emotional experience. But of course, we operate in front of clients, we operate in professional settings, and in boardrooms. And you can't very well just suddenly stop things and say, hang on, I want to tell you a story about this, why you need to listen weeping. To me.
That wouldn't be appropriate. I'm just seeing if I've got my very high, here we go, my very high tech coaching tool here, because actually I can tell you something about. I don't know, George, are you old enough or are you young enough to remember playing that game when you were a kid where you get a piece of string and 2 empty tin cans and you go, hi George, how are you? Can you hear me? You go, David, I can hear you. Did you ever play that game?
I make my children do it. I don't allow them mobile phones or anything like that. This is how they have to communicate.
Well, the thing that I would say about that is think of that as like your communication. Your job as a storyteller, as a listener, indeed, from the moment that you step in front of somebody, and that's anywhere, whether it's in a presentation, whether it's in a board meeting, whether it's in a networking event, whatever it is, your job is to get the string tight and to keep it tight from the moment you appear in front of another person, or on Zoom, indeed, to the moment that you leave. And if that string goes slack, then basically they're going to be thinking about something else. And that will go slack because either the way you're telling, or the content of the story is wrong, or the way that you're telling it's wrong. And if we talk about the way that you're telling it, then there are a couple of 3-word things that I would leave people with. I always tell people to find what I call the inner UFO, which stands for upright, forward, and open. And the upright bit is about sort of just using the length of your body, just look like you want to be there, just actually use that height. Apart from anything, it gets the energy coursing through you. If you think of like a hose pipe, if you're watering the garden, it's a bit kicked over, then the water doesn't come out. If you're not using your length, then your breath and your energy can't come out. So get upright. The forward is about getting your energy forward to the other person. So you can see now that, you know, all my gestures are towards you, George. That's been measured psychologically as well, is that energy forward like that reads much better than backwards like that. And there's this is from a guy called Mark Bowden, who's a big, he's a very famous body language person. He talks about the door frame. Imagine there's a door frame around you. You got 3 choices, basically. You could either be behind the door frame, in which case I'd be talking to you like this, and you can automatically see that either I look like I don't care, or I'm not very confident, or I could be in the middle of the door frame, so it's running right down my body there, which looks absolutely neutral like that, or I can come slightly in front of the door frame. And so automatically you're leaning into the other person. It looks like you want to connect with them as well. So upright, use your length, get forward, and then open is about sort of using your width, using the, show your underbelly. I have nothing to hide. I am your friend. Allow your gestures to be open like that. Find your inner UFO. Upright, forward, and open will help you be a great storyteller. It also helps you find different notes in your voice.
I love that. I think that's a really powerful way to remember about connection. And of course, in these days, it's very easy for people to come online and sit with their cameras off. And then we wonder why things take ages to be achieved, because actually we're just not connecting anymore. And there are tricks you can use in a virtual environment to actually connect. And I think what you've just explained there, the UFO, can just as easily be done online as you and I are doing now.
I agree.
Leaning forward. Go for it. I think I know what you're about to say.
If I think right to the beginning of this, actually, I mean, you know, while the music was playing and we were waiting for the cameras to go on, there's one thing I always say to myself before every meeting, and it's I'm actually standing today, so I always say to myself, stand up, smile, and serve. And I think you could do that online. You can do that before you go into a meeting. The stand up is about using your length. It's about looking like you want to be there. Smile looks like you're warm, that you actually care about the other person. And I think the serve thing is really interesting. How can I serve you? How can I make this the best hour of your lives? How can I help you over the next hour? Because if you go in with an attitude of service, I think your stories will always be geared towards that. Your communication will always be geared to helping other. You will avoid being arrogant. You will be assertive. Doesn't stop you being strong, but it'll stop any arrogance. So stand up, sit up, smile, and serve.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And one last thing, which I'd love your opinion on. I certainly have an opinion on it. Is the S word?
Yeah, avoid. The S word is the word story, isn't it?
Yes.
Do you know what? Okay, this brings us right back to the beginning. Because in business, there are a number of people, a lot of people actually. As soon as you say, "I'm going to tell you a story about such and such," immediately it's like this flashing BS, 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 BS. It's like I don't want stories. People do want stories, but they want the facts in context, told with feeling. We sort our lives out in stories. I don't know if I said this earlier, coming back to the ABT, I was sitting in my kitchen this morning and I was really looking forward to having a great conversation with George. But then I realized I didn't have the Zoom link. So therefore, I got onto Simon on the email. I said, Simon, can we have the email link to this one, to the Zoom link to this? It's how we organize our lives. Is people want stories, people need stories, people organize their lives in terms of stories. Tell them stories, just don't tell them you're telling them a story.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more. As soon as I hear, I need to tell you a story about that. Oh, I've got a great story about such a, oh my goodness. There's just a switch in your brain that just goes off. So tell the stories, but don't let people think that you are telling the stories. So if I think about just some of the things I've heard today, David, and what a terrific conversation. Thank you very, very much. I think either we've bored our audience to death or they, because there's no questions. So, or they're listening intently and to what we're talking about. And I'm sure it's the latter. But what I've heard today, and just a quick summary, is ABT, and, but, therefore, fantastic in terms of actually framing a story. Then I think about the relationship triangle and actually using that to within ABT to work our way through that relationship triangle. Then I think about the science behind a story. So, how you make a story great, which is the time and the place and the character that goes through the story, and then the point of the story. What is the point that you're trying to make? And often making the point at the beginning and then going down into the moments. Go down into the moments and try to use dialogue to get the moments, and then come back up again to go on with the story, and put a bit of adversity in your story as well. And then really it's about the rehearsal. So making sure you rehearse and plan for all the different types of story you could tell in different scenarios, and never ever use the S word.
If you remember nothing else, never use the S word.
So it only leaves for me to say thank you so much for a really, really rewarding hour. I've certainly enjoyed it. I'm sure our audience have. Please do follow David on LinkedIn, David Pullen Story Spotters. Obviously, follow INN8 on LinkedIn for more webinars of this sort of high quality and high engagement and high energy. I'm sure you've all enjoyed it. Thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
INN8 is a registered trademark of Stanlib Wealth Management Pty Limited, an authorised financial services provider.